JiaJia Fei is a digital strategist and founder of the first digital agency for art. In her work with museums, galleries, and artists, her practice centers on the mission of making art more accessible through technology. Prior to starting her own consultancy, JiaJia served as the first director of digital at the Jewish Museum in New York and associate director of digital marketing at the Salon Guggenheim Museum. JiaJia received her BA in the history of art from Bryn Mawr College and has lectured on the impact of art and technology worldwide. So glad you can join us. Thank you so much. Are you ready to go?
Thank you, Melanie. And thank you everyone for being here today. It's nice to meet all of your black squares in front of me, but I'm imagining a very enthusiastic audience. I'm going to start by sharing my screen, and then I will explain this image to everyone. So I'm going to be talking to you today about my career trajectory. So as you may all recall, a few weeks ago, everyone was trying to look for pictures of themselves at 21. And this may not apply to this audience because I think many of you are probably 21. But I went back into my photos and found this image of me. I don't know what I'm wearing, but I'm wearing this sculpture that my friend Jesse made. He's a professor at your school. And it reminded me of this moment when we were both in art school and I was trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life. So I knew a lot of things I didn't want to do. I knew I didn't necessarily want to be an artist, perhaps professionally. I didn't want to be a curator, even though I was studying art history. So I took a bunch of these classes exploring, trying to understand where I could fit in this space that I really didn't have much familiarity with. My friend and I were both in this class, and a lot of our classmates ended up becoming artists. They ended up becoming represented by galleries and really pursued this very creative career. And I remember when I was in school, a majority of the feedback that I got about my artwork was not necessarily about the work itself, but about the writing and the artist statements. And I felt like that was my sign to go into communication and perhaps a light suggestion that I should not become an artist. But in any case, my world continues to be surrounded by artists and people who inspire me in many different ways, both, as artists and perhaps even as designers or technologists, people who perhaps think about technology more as a design solution, which is a lot of what I do. So my talk for you today is about how I went about finding this niche, particularly at a time when the art world is continuing to become a little bit more technologically savvy. And if we look back into the history of the web, there's a very direct correlation between how I personally emerged as a professional. I ended up using the internet, when I was first in middle school, and I think I'm still very lucky to have had this like analog existence before that period. Facebook launched in my first year of college. I remember we all decided to disable our accounts when we had midterms because it was such a distraction. And now it's like the #1 marketing tool that everyone uses, right? I also went into the job in museum career field when these emerging social media platforms began becoming more widely used. I created the first Instagram account for the Guggenheim and many of these different institutions when they were really trying to find their voice and find how they could exist online and become more interactive and become more accessible by putting a lot of their content and scholarship online. There was a little disruption to the world around 2020. So after working a few full-time jobs, I always knew my ultimate goal was to create my own company. and start my own consulting practice, kind of taking all of the stuff that I've been doing already within institutions, working with other people in the art world, whether it's galleries, artists, like just friends and creative collaborators, to really go beyond the institutions. And so just a few months before the COVID outbreak, I launched my own company. And it was incredible timing because, as you know, every physical space closed down. And I was basically the only person doing this. And it became, like driving factor of so much of what I continue to do today, which is try to think about how to translate the work of whether it's museums and galleries and arts organizations into the digital space so they can coexist both online and have in-person experiences as well. Just the sheer speed in which technology has shifted within this period is really crazy, to the extent in which every job that I've had essentially didn't exist before. And I think that's going to be even more true for all of you with the rise of AI and many of these emerging technologies that I think people are still trying to grapple with. The art world, however, is still very traditional. I think even today, we can say this about a lot of institutions, a lot of brick and mortar spaces, they still embrace this very like singular way of communicating. In the way in which you publish books, you present exhibitions, things sort of go up and come down. But the whole idea of the internet is that there is no chronology. There is no beginning or end. You have to keep producing things and keep communicating. And that essentially became the nature of my business. The whole world has been impacted by this. Every time I pull these numbers, I get really scared by how quickly a lot of these platforms have grown. And so I'm just going to go very quickly through the chronology of my work. So I spent about 6 years working at the Guggenheim. We launched like the very beginning of social media, and this is like super old school Twitter from like 10 years ago. And this era where museums are still trying to figure out like, how do we interact with people? Do we like, what is our personality? How do we define who we are? So that's like at the time, it was very new for a lot of institutions to be doing this, but now it's incredibly ubiquitous, and every brand, I would argue, has put even more emphasis on their social media presence in some ways than their web presence. We also worked on some really incredible collaborations at the time. This was a projection done during our collaboration with YouTube when we launched the world's first biennial of video. However, it only happened once, so it wasn't necessarily biennial. But again, like the presence of technology and user-generated content entering the museum space. After a few years, I was asked to create the first digital department at the Jewish Museum. It's technically only 3 blocks down from the Guggenheim. And we kind of started from scratch. I built the team. We ended up really just thinking very efficiently about how technology can impact the museum in ways that weren't necessarily about designing shiny objects, but using technology as design solutions to help improve user experience and visitor experiences. So at the time, you might recall that many museums were like creating their own apps, and it was incredibly annoying even for me as a visitor to have to download a new app every single time I went to a different museum. So we decided to just make something very user-friendly, web-based, so that you didn't have to go through that barrier for entry. And a lot of the content and multimedia experiences existed on this mobile guide. We also were sometimes involved in in-gallery technology. I'm very wary of like museums that implement too many shiny objects and like VR projects, but in the case of certain instances, when you're trying to translate physical spaces like architecture, we had an exhibition that surrounded, interior spaces in France. You obviously can't import interiors from another country, and so With the architects that designed the exhibition, there were renderings of interiors of these homes designed by this French architect, Pierre Chareau, that we also decided to make more widely available on our website. I don't know if many of you have tried the new Apple Vision Pro, but it just reminds me of this experience of technology that paradoxically is also very isolating because only you are able to have that experience, right? So we're in this weird situation where like we're in this like physical space putting on a digital device, but yet you're limiting the experience of that content. So, you know, even just like sharing devices is very weird and not very easy. So how can we make those experiences, again, more widely available by thinking about the lowest common denominator of visitor experiences? And today, everyone has a phone, everyone has a computer. So we made sure that these experiences were also available on the web. So when I was trying to figure out what I was going to do for work after that octopus costume, you know, I think there were, and there still are, these very codified positions that exist in museums. You know, they're curators, they're educators, they're conservators, but especially in the last few years, we've seen job titles entirely change and new job titles created, especially, you know, in my position where you're basically trying to create, you know, a whole new audience, engage with a whole new sector that museums typically didn't engage with before. So these titles have evolved to respond to the audiences and the demands of what it means to operate an institution, and not just a museum, but a gallery, a foundation, you know, any type of business that has a public-facing audience. You are now tasked to operate a physical space and a virtual space. And this was incredibly true during the pandemic when a lot of physical spaces closed down. And the only thing you could do is think about how you engage with those audiences online. So a couple of years ago, I decided to start my own company and take this show on the road and work with a much wider group of people in the art world. Most of my clients are, I would say, in the art or design world, just because that's my area of interest. And also because it's really an industry that is so behind when it comes to technology. If you think about all of the creative industries, whether it's film or music or fashion, like the art world is like the last sector to like figure out what they're doing online and figure out what they're doing with technology. And it's so bespoke. It's very particular. I think we're dually alienating in terms of, you know, being able to reach a wide audience because our content is so obscure and nuanced. But then we also don't have the possibility of working with, you know, a tech partner or collaborator to translate what we do in the online space because of that inaccessibility. So I work with primarily museums, galleries, artists and collectives, arts organizations, and sometimes even collectors. Some of my clients include museums like Glenstone, which is this really beautiful space outside of Washington, D.C. I also work with galleries like Lehman Maupin, and I'm including this here because I remember my first job interview was at this space, and I knew it was not a fit, but like years later, think about it, I now work with them. And then artists, including Hank Willis Thomas and his collective For Freedoms. So this is a relatively, I guess, like new position and title that people often don't really know much about, and I think could also encapsulate a lot of different things. So in my work as a digital strategist, I work with my clients on essentially building their digital presence online and thinking about how to translate what they do for an online audience in pursuit of whether it's their mission or business objectives. So I do things like build websites, help people get to those websites through search engine marketing campaigns, email campaigns, create content, whether it's through social media or multimedia like audio and video. But I think the most important part of what I do is thinking about not necessarily the platforms and the technology itself, but thinking about the story. So I very much instead see myself as this interpreter, trying to translate things and becoming, much more relevant and accessible and easy to understand. There's a lot of translation that needs to happen in the art world. For many of you who've probably been to a museum or gallery, picked up a press release or read a wall label, you'll encounter a lot of language that doesn't mean anything. Like none of it needs to be this verbose. None of it needs to be in French. And so we're very guilty of, talking about art in this way that is very inaccessible to a wide audience. On the other hand, I think technologists, very often do the same, whether it's through speaking about, acronyms and, various keywords. We're all kind of very immersed in these niches. And as creative technologists working at the intersection of many different niches, we have to be both fluent in the language of art and technology. So to oversimplify the experience of digital content, it's really just thinking about what is the story you're trying to tell, and here are all the different nuanced ways that you can tell that story across different platforms. So if you think about when you hear about an exhibition, or you think about an artist, many different forms of communication come together to impact your understanding of what that is and who that person is. So it's the story that we tell and user experience and everything else, on websites, on social and third-party platforms, the stories that other people are telling about you, and that involves working with journalists in the PR campaign, the paid marketing of trying to increase that exposure, both in the real world and online. And all of that generates, an overall understanding, which is essentially the idea of branding. This is a vastly oversimplified description of the nuances between all these different fields and how they come together to demonstrate one's understanding of what someone or an organization or a gallery is how it's positioned, right? So in marketing, you have this person saying, I'm a great lover. So you're telling the story yourself. In PR, you're working with journalists and writers to position and craft that story. So people are hearing it from another source. This girl saying, trust me, he's a great lover. In advertising, you're saying your what you want to say over and over again. But all these different stories come together with this understanding that we also want to achieve. The whole notion of technology in museums, I've always known, is a bit of a paradox because technology is new. You're always working on the next version. The moment you release something, you have to be working on 2.0. And the entire definition of museums is, we're preserving this for generations and generations. So innovation in technology is always looking towards the future, whereas the whole mission of museums is about preservation of the past. All this comes together because if you think about it, for the first time in the history of art, we're experiencing art online before people ever see it in person. Every time I hear about a show or an artist, it's like a website, an Instagram post. All of our interactions and initial engagements with art, and I think honestly, most things in the world now start online. So it's so important to correctly craft that story and really put your information out there. I'm going to close with a quote that I think is still very relevant, even though I feel like so much has changed since this has been published. This is a quote from Ed Williams, who was one of the co-founders of Twitter back when it was still called Twitter, describing, what people do on the internet. He says, we often think the internet enables you to do new things, but people just want to do the same things they've always done. Take a human desire, preferably one that's been around for a really long time, identify that desire, and then use modern technology to take out the steps. So when you apply that logic to every major tech company in the world, it's a direct correlation between something that humans have always done. If you want to go shopping or order food or, like any of these leisurely activities, there's literally an app for every single one of these things, except for the experience of looking at art. In many ways, I think there are explanations beyond technology that can explain this. I think art, unlike some of these other forms, have multiple dimensions. They exist, whether it's in a painting, in a photograph, in an installation, or even a performance. There's so many different dimensions and experiences that can't necessarily be captured in a single form. But I think it's also this very weird situation and coincidence where we've made art so inaccessible that you can't turn it into an app, right? It's so much more complex and so nuanced. I think about this all the time when, like you think about the changes that have happened to e-com and like retail stores shutting down, people just getting all their, all the things they want to buy or all the things they want to do online. That's never going to happen to art, because going to a museum, going to a gallery is always going to be a social experience. Interacting with physical objects is also about the relationship between the object and your physical being and being in that space. It's multisensory. I also think about what's going to happen with automation and AI, and there's so much information out there that can be very rapidly, summarized and accessible through whether it's like ChatGPT or like any of these tools. But if you've noticed and played with all of these bots, the art is so bad. Like anytime I use ChatGPT for art, it's so bad. And the reason is, where do we place all of our scholarship and knowledge? All that stuff is in books. None of it is digitized. None of it is online. So it's like almost to our benefit, weirdly, that this industry will continue to exist. I think there's some things that will change, but I'm excited to talk to you, Melanie, in the next couple of minutes about some of this. But these are just some of the questions that I constantly think about in my work. How the changes in technology will continue to change the ways in which we experience art. Melanie told me that she watched this TED Talk I did like 10 years ago, which is like so early in my career that I don't want to revisit it. But I talk about how social media has changed the ways that we interact with art. And, back, in the emergence of like these like fake museums that have borrowed the visual aesthetics of like a James Turrell or like a Yayoi Kusama experience, and then commodifying into like a food museum. So much of it is based on the experiences that we see from social media platforms and then wanting to have those experiences ourselves. Something else I often think about is just knowing the inequities that exist already in the art world on so many levels. How can we stop technology from replicating these inequities? Whether it's just the representation of information, thinking about how we design to, become more inclusive. There's so many things that get exacerbated as content proliferates. And then my final question, which is sort of like a riddle, is usually how I approach most of my projects. So, this happens all the time with museums where like they're like, we want an app, we want like this like AI bot thing. And there's never really a problem they're trying to solve with technology. It's often like, we want to design this shiny thing because everyone's talking about it, and then ends up being incredibly expensive and useless. So before approaching any project, I always ask myself and I ask the client, if technology is the answer, what was the question? So we always try to start with, what are the problems we're trying to solve? Otherwise, you're just creating new problems. So I will pause there. And we can, talk more
Thank
about
you.
my octopus picture.
Thank you so much. It was really, the TED Talk was amazing and prescient. And so I appreciate hearing initial thoughts then and more thoughts now. But would like to open it up to people attending. Any thoughts or questions? Please put them in the chat. Okay, we have two. Wow. Matthias, could you go first and then we'll go to Cole.
Yeah, hi. I have like, I guess, a double question or like two questions connected. First, I was wondering if, did you ever, maybe especially at the beginning of your career, face a resistance from all of these institutions like museums or galleries to move to the digital world? And I guess related to that, how did the process of like managing, like looking for clients, especially at the beginning, went? Like, was it hard because you found this kind of resistance, or was it the opposite that people were like excited to move into this new world or dimension?
Thanks, Matthias. Those are great questions. So to answer your first question, yes, there is always a lot of resistance. And I think depending on where you go, there will continue to be resistance wherever you know, at any institution and museum, especially. I think the foundation of a lot of this is just the organizational design of institutions these days. You'll often see, especially when it comes to curators and people who've been at the institution for a very long time, you know, they're used to working a very specific way because they've been there for 20, 30, 40 years. And I think my approach has always been about becoming more of an internal educator and trying to make a lot of these barriers become, you know, something that may potentially benefit them. So, you know, I think a lot of people are very fearful when it comes to sharing too much because, you know, there's both like the whole like IP thing, but then I think some people are just like afraid of putting too much of their work online. And I always start with the question like, do you want your work to reach more people? And the answer is never no. So I think positioning things so that you know, people understand the value of what you're doing. And then ultimately, if you work at a museum, positioning your work in the context of the mission is always gonna, you know, kind of present you know, an argument that is really difficult to challenge. Um, I think your other question regarding clients is definitely something that you know, I feel very lucky to have approached very organically. Um, I was talking to a friend about business development, right? So they're like, "Oh, what do you do for business development?" Like, this is like I never really thought about it. Like, I'm not like out there like pitching or like going out to like find clients. But the reason for that is theoretically, my entire career before then was business development. So even though I wasn't necessarily working with people um, while I was working within these institutions, I considered everything that I did a part of my own professional development. So like going to art fairs, biennials, traveling, going to like openings and like supporting friends and just being out there in the world, like the social work is also work, particularly in the art world, I think. So when I started my own company, I sort of had this built-in audience of people who knew me out there and like vaguely what I did. But then once you define it and become very clear in your own strategy for outreach, I've been very fortunate to basically just have people come to me. And I've had to like turn a lot of people down just due to capacity. But I definitely encourage, you know, in whatever business you're doing, to really think about the long-term impact, because a conversation that you have today could impact work that you do like 10 years from now. And I think when it comes to, you know, the art world and this very niche sector, it's like, you know, once you're in it, you sort of know everybody who's a part of it. And it's to your advantage to really put yourself out there.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate how carefully you frame the questions and how you are framing clearly the strategies. Okay, so we have a couple people on deck. Let's go to Colby, and then there's a question from Terry in the chat.
Hey, JiaJia, thanks for taking time to talk with us today. I was kind of curious about if you ever thought there was going to be like a platform or app or something like Spotify where like I feel like all artists are kind of like Beyonce, or like someone who only has like 10 listeners kind of looks the same. And if you think that like an idea like that would be viable, or kind of like what type of impact that would have like on the art world. And I'm just kind of like, I don't know, curious about like why hasn't that shown up yet? Why do you think that hasn't shown up yet? And like if you think that that would be possible.
Yeah, that's exactly like what I was trying to get with that slide of like, here are all the things that people do, here are the apps, and like that doesn't exist yet for art, right? Theoretically, when Artsy launched, I think they were trying to be, at the time they called it the Pandora when people were actually using Pandora, but yeah, the Spotify of art, because they wanted every artist across emerging, professionally established levels to be on this platform. And it's at the end of the day a marketplace too, because it's more so, I would say, about sales than any type of engagement or discovery. The company itself has gone through a lot of changes. I think they have done a lot of great work when it comes to thinking about using technology to power search and discovery. The Art Genome Project basically like is like a massive like metadata undertaking to classify all the work they have in their database. But at the same time, it also is about the partners and the people who participate. Not everyone is on the platform. The closest thing I can imagine to being a Spotify is honestly Instagram. It is like the platform of record if you're an artist, if you're an arts organization, if you're a gallery. It's like the magazine of the world. Without an Instagram presence, my other like unexpected side hustle has been like helping sometimes like galleries who get locked out of their Instagram accounts like reset their password, right? Because without that, they don't have a lifeline, they don't have a presence, they don't have an existence. I actually don't know if something more ubiquitous will emerge because it already has that level of impact. And I also think, again, like it's so niche. I think like just based on everything that I've said, like by design, the art world is meant to be a bit exclusive, that I don't think any tech company is going to be like really like trying to impact the market in this way.
Thank you so much. I mean, yeah, Instagram also, there's a question of age too. You have people who are younger, older, people who are consider themselves professional, students. So it gets around that barrier of like, are you an artist? You know, I don't even know what that means or how we would decide. We have a question in the chat from Terry. Terry, would you like to voice that yourself? If so, you can unmute.
Yeah, my question is, I mean, this idea of like, you see this a lot of institutions or companies wanting to use like the most popular technology to make something, and it ends up being, like you said, not useful, very expensive, and waste of time. Do you have any examples of when working with institutions that this went the right way and something was created that was very useful or impactful?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's so many examples of museums that have done this wrong, because I think the pattern that I always observe is that they're often doing these projects around capital projects. So they're doing like a building expansion, or there's like a new museum opening and they have all this money all at once. But it's okay to like spend a lot of money on architecture because that's going to be around for a while. But when they try to spend that money on technology, you essentially have this like dated device in your galleries and no budget to maintain it or update it over time. So it becomes incredibly unsuccessful in the long run because they don't really plan ahead for how quickly it needs to evolve. There have been a few examples of digital experiences I've had in galleries that actually make me feel like this is like a great solution to a problem. I went to a museum a few years ago where someone told me that there was like some like hologram thing that I need to check out. And at first I was very suspicious. But it was basically one of the first uses of AI and chatbots. So at the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York, there was this traveling project where they were collecting oral histories of Holocaust survivors. And because, a lot of them are basically, like dead at this point, we need to preserve their stories. And they recorded hours and hours and hours of conversation with these survivors, to the point in which they had an image projected onto a screen that you could interact with. So you could ask, like, what's your name? What's your story? Even questions like, what's your favorite color? And based on the recordings, you would basically have this simulated conversation as if you were talking to the survivor. And I think they've implemented this at a few other museums that really revolve around, like witness testimony and oral history, the Equal Justice Initiative in Alabama. And, I saw this project like probably like 10 years ago. And I think with the technology that's available today, I can imagine like, a much, more engaging version of this around many history museums, potentially even talking to artists. I think they tried to do this for a Van Gogh exhibition recently. But I think like using that idea of recording, deep amounts of content to make that more interactive and more relevant to a present day audience, I think was like at the time, like a pretty advanced use of what they had. And I'm sure we'll probably see more of that in the future.
Thank you. That's so interesting. I mean, like an idea for, it's a digital memorial. And I remember after 9/11, there was a lot of interface design where people had tons of content because they wanted to be able to capture all different sides of what went on that day. And there was a big question because at the time, bandwidth was not up to the task of being able to store this or stream this online. But we're at that point where, the interfaces have like caught up to the amount and the speed. So I wonder, we have time for at least one more question. Does anyone else attending have a question? I have one, but I would prefer to wait. Oh, yes, Tianren, do you want to open your?
Hi, JiaJia, thank you for sharing. I have two questions. One is, I feel like it's very surprising, but also not surprising at all that the art world, especially in terms of the institutions, are so not digitized. And I'm wondering, do you see this condition changing in the past few years, especially since COVID and after you started your company? And another question is, I'm very curious how your team is organized. So like, for example, how is it structured and what is done in-house and what is outsourced, because you work on like a range of things.
Yeah, thanks for your question. So I'll talk about my team first. I am very conscious of not becoming one of those agencies where you have like a meeting with someone, but then you like work with another person. So I'm deeply involved in all of the projects and clients that I work with. And depending on the projects, I have a team of collaborators and partners, whether it's like web developers, designers, researchers, people who are just doing like day-to-day like social media stuff. So it really depends on the project and depends on just like the intake. But I make sure that I am present in all the meetings, and I think that's honestly my biggest challenge because there are only so many meetings you can take in a day. So I think, it really depends on, I've seen like many different models. There are a lot of, I wouldn't say like my PR organizations, but a lot of PR companies tend to have like dozens and dozens of people, and then they have people who just get like assigned a specific client and a specific project. But in my experience, the people who have reached out to me specifically want to work with me. So I want to make sure that they, they have that expectation that's managed. Wait, remind me of your other question. If you can unmute. Thank you.
Have you seen this condition or this market
right.
changing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there definitely was a big change after COVID. I think, museums realized how under-resourced and how behind they were when it came to like digital initiatives. I think overall, this is on trend with the rest of the world. They sort of like put all of their eggs in this basket because they removed them from the other basket. But then when it came time to resume operations, they realized they couldn't do both. A lot of my work sometimes is also about like being the consultant who gets put in front of a board of trustees to make the case for additional funding. Funding at museums especially is pretty finite. They're not going to just give you like double the budget to do both the digital and the in-person work. So just making the case of this is the long-term survival of your organization in terms of bare minimum operations, in terms of the cost of doing business. There's a lot of investment that needs to happen with infrastructure. A lot of it is really, really unsexy. It's like, we need to upgrade our servers to support, the bandwidth of all of this work that we're doing. A lot of it is like infrastructure and like systems and trying to evaluate like what are the things we need to do to build around to sustain operations. A lot of it is incredibly expensive, but I think people do understand it's a long-term investment. I'm working on a project now where a museum is investing significantly in a physical expansion, but also thinking about how do they mirror that in terms of a digital expansion. And so much of the work in technology is very parallel, I would say, to architecture, where you're designing a blueprint of experiences. You're doing the research, you're trying to understand what people need and how we create these experiences for them. And then we build the space, we create something from nothing, and then over time we iterate. I actually wish we could iterate architecture and design a little bit more, but I think a lot of institutions are now realizing we need to be doing parallel, work in terms of rigor and radicality in the digital space and dedicate, similar or, comparable resources in the work that's done online.
Wonderful. Thank you. One last question. Let's see. One last question, people. What are we thinking? Okay, I'm going to voice one, but if anyone thinks of something in the next minute, please put it in the chat because it will preempt and we will preempt me. So I was, as I mentioned, I appreciated hearing the talk from several years ago to think about how these questions are continually evolving. There's no like singular solution. It's always in context with whatever's going on. So I think at the time, and I'm going to paraphrase this badly, so you should absolutely correct me, but there was something like with the rapid digitization of images, will this reduce or expand our experience of art? So I was wondering, like in that time, has anything unexpected, and it doesn't have to be reduce or expand, maybe you found a different axis, it doesn't have to be greater or lesser, but any unexpected advantages to bringing more access online, or any unexpected concerns, either one or both, that you have found through your research and your work over the past few years?
I'm going to talk about something I hate talking about, which is NFTs. And people always conflate what I do with Web3 because they think art and they think digital. They're like, oh, you make NFTs? Like, absolutely not. But I specifically recall during that period when, the art world and even just the crypto world in general was going crazy over NFTs. And, I think a part of me was still very excited because it was one of the first instances where born digital artwork finally had a space in the market. And I think with the exception of when I say you can't replicate art online in the way that you can with all these other fields and all these other mediums, the exception is art that was made to be viewed online. And I think those artists in particular face a lot of challenges because, how do you create a market around stuff that just exists in a way for everyone? How do you create, a commodity around something that isn't meant to have that quality of scarcity, which is really how we position and value art objects. So that was a pretty interesting time for the art world, and I think just the world in general. And I think, that market has rapidly crashed, but I think there's still a lot of potential in blockchain technology for, again, creating these solutions. So things like authenticating artwork and also making sure that artists are paid royalties for the reproduction and resale of their work. So something that's always been really criminal in the art world is in the auction world, for example, when a painting or an artwork goes up for auction, the artist sees none of that, right? So very few people know that. Say you made something, it sold to a collector, you're now making the big bucks, but the collector decides to flip the work. You're not seeing a cent of that sale. So what blockchain technology, and I think some companies have started doing, is thinking about how we can authenticate and create a system of codified royalties for artists who, even when it comes to physical artworks, can be paid through that process. And again, something that has been very well figured out in other creative fields.
Thank you. That I was asking about anything unexpected, and that was a very unexpected answer. There was something not long ago in the Times about artists who make work about social injustice or make work about colonialism or themes of extraction, then participating in the art market and then seeing their work flipped, and just how what headspace you might be in to consider the ramifications of that. Okay, well, it is 3:56, so I am going to close it out. And thank you so much, JiaJia, for joining us and sharing your work and sharing these interesting questions that it was nice to have some time to consider. Everybody, have a good rest of day. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.